In this section, we'll talk about the physiology and function of the spinal cord. We'll take a look at some anatomical features and how the anatomical features are associated with the function of the spinal cord. So how does information travel in the spinal cord? Information comes in through a receptor and sensory neuron that go to the dorsal horn. Our spinal cord integrates information through interneurons that are located in the gray matter. Interneurons can also pass into the white matter and go to the brain. So white matter tracts, or bundles of fibers, conduct nerve impulses to and from the brain. The gray matter, with its interneurons, receives and integrates incoming and outgoing information to perform spinal reflexes. So once the interneuron has integrated the information, it will send out a signal on an efferent motor neuron to an effector. Gray matter in the spinal cord includes a pair of dorsal or posterior horns, and a dorsal root comes into the dorsal horn. This dorsal root is composed totally of sensory fibers. We also have a pair of ventral or anterior horns. The ventral horns give rise to motor neurons that leave through the ventral root. The ventral root of the spinal nerve is totally motor fibers. The two halves of the butterfly are connected by gray commissures. A commissure is a bridge. There's a gray commissure or bridge in front of the central canal, and there's a gray commissure or bridge posterior to the central canal. The central canal is a small hole or tube that goes through the middle of the spinal cord and is continuous with the fourth ventricle up above. So cerebrospinal fluid fills up that central canal. The white matter in the spinal cord is arranged into columns. White columns are bundles of myelinated axons that carry signals up and down to and from the brain and brainstem. There are three pairs, left and right, of columns or funiculi. We have a right and left dorsal column, a right and left lateral column, and right and left anterior columns. Each column is filled with named tracts or fasciculi. These are fibers with a similar origin, destination, and function. Sometimes I refer to these tracts as highways that go from a similar location to a similar location. These highways or tracts map to specific locations on the spinal cord. We're going to take a look at a few of these. Ascending tracts ascend towards the brain. Descending tracts head down towards the body. Decussation means that the fibers cross sides from right to left or left to right. Contralateral means the origin and destination are on opposite sides of the spinal cord, whereas ipsilateral means they're on the same side of the body. Ascending pathways carry sensory information from the body to the brain. You should know three specific ascending pathways. The dorsal column ascending pathway is located in the dorsal column. It carries signals about deep touch, visceral pain, vibration, and proprioception from the arm and leg. So if your cell phone is in your pocket on your leg and it vibrates, that sensation is carried up the dorsal column ascending pathway. The spinocerebellar pathway carries proprioceptive signals from the limbs and trunk up to the cerebellum. You will notice that the origin of the pathway, the spine, is at the beginning of the word, and the destination is at the end of the word. So if we were to name a highway, the Phoenix-Tucson Highway, it would go from Phoenix to Tucson. and that's how we name our tracks or pathways. So our spinocerebellar pathway goes from the spine to the cerebellum. Since we know that the cerebellum has to do with sensing where the body is and whether the body is doing what we think it's doing, it makes sense that proprioception comes up and goes to the cerebellum. The last pathway we'll talk about is the spinothalamic pathway, which goes from the spine to the thalamus, and it carries information about pain, pressure, temperature, light touch, tickle, and itch. You'll notice that its fibers cross over before they head up to the thalamus and then to our cortex for perception of this information. Our descending motor tracts come from the brain out to the body. They carry motor information. For our voluntary movement, we have a direct tract. It comes directly from the primary motor cortex down through the spinal column to our somatic motor neurons. The direct tract that we'll discuss is the corticospinal tract. It comes from the cortex of the brain and deals with precise, coordinated limb movements. We also have indirect tracts that have a stop along the way for involuntary movements. The tectospinal tract comes from the tectum of the midbrain and goes to the spine and deals with reflex turning of the head in response to sights and sounds. Since the tectum of the midbrain contains our superior and inferior colliculi, which integrate reflexes in response to sights and sounds, this makes sense. Our vestibulospinal tract comes from the brainstem nuclei and takes information from the vestibule of the inner ear and sends information out to our postural muscles. So this helps to keep us upright when we're sitting around or walking. Our reticulospinal tract, which is from the reticular formation or reticular activating system, controls limb movements important to maintain posture and balance. So you'll notice that all of these descending motor tracts have spinal in the second part of their name because that's where they're going to. The first part of their name tells you where they're coming from and gives you a hint as to what they do. Next, we're going to start looking at the spinal nerves.